We're running a little behind, so we've got to keep this thing rolling, and we do want to make some time available during the course of the day to those of you who are here to ask questions and so on. So we've got to keep things moving along. One of the great joys of being here at Northeastern, and I've been here now for 20 years, is the opportunity I've had to get to know and to work with some very special people, especially in the political science department. Barry and I knew each other before he arrived here several years ago, but it's been a wonderful collaboration and a wonderful friendship, and he and his dear wife Emmy were the people that really came up with this idea in the first place. And I can't begin to tell you how hard he and his staff and colleagues have worked to get us here. So he's going to kick off this second session of ours on the economy. Where are we now? We've got 3 additional speakers, and then I hope if we can open things up a little bit for questions, if that makes sense. Professor Bluestone.
Working?
Try it again. Try it again. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
There we go.
Can you hear us?
Okay, great. I'm going to sit here with my colleagues and just introduce data. That's what this first panel is about, plus a discussion of history. It's not working? Okay, I'll do it very. So we're going to look at a bunch of topics here: economic growth, unemployment, income, and inequality in America. And I presume you can see above my shoulders. You can take a look at these slides. We had a terrible, terrible recession, of course, that began in December '07. You can see the decline in our change in gross domestic product to the point where we're losing almost 9% of our economic growth. We then started having a real recovery. We had growth of almost 4% in the first quarter of 2010, but since then the economy has sputtered. And it continues to sputter and will continue to sputter unless we take positive action. What's happened to jobs? There's been almost no growth in jobs since early 2010. We started to see some improvement, and it's been flat, with jobs around 139 million. If you look at it in terms of unemployment, we have 14 million people unemployed. That continues to be an unbelievably large number of people unemployed, and that doesn't include people who are working part-time, who want full-time jobs, or people who are discouraged and have dropped out of the labor force. It means that we've kept an unemployment rate of 9%. The Congressional Budget Office has just suggested, a nonpartisan agency of the government, that unless we take greater action, we will not get back to full employment, which they define as 6% unemployment, until 2017. So what's happened to household income? If we go back to the end of World War II, you'll see that household income grew very rapidly. Between 1947 and 73, real income in the population would double. But what was most interesting is that those at the bottom saw their income rise faster than the highest income. And so we had a reduction in inequality, and we had a reduction in poverty. But beginning in 1973, that turned around, and we began to see much more rapid growth of those in the highest quintile, and almost no growth in the lowest 20%. And between 2000 and 2004, when we had the last recession before this one, it was the people at the bottom who suffered the most. Now what we can see between 1979 and 2003, that long period suffering economy, if there was growth at all, it came in the top 1% and the top 5%, with very little growth for anyone else. You can see that also when we look at 1995 to 2000. Most of the major growth came not just in the top 1% versus 99, but the top 1/100th of 1%, the very, very rich. When we look at it in a different way, we'll see the same thing. You'll look at the bottom quintile, which is the green one at the bottom, almost no growth over that period, but all of the growth going to the top. You can actually see those 3 periods at the very bottom, 1965 to 1980. That green line is the lowest quintile. They saw their income rise faster than anyone else. But then look at 1990 to 2000 and beyond, just the opposite. That is what has changed in America. An America that was growing rapidly and becoming more equal, and then an economy growing much more slowly and becoming very much more unequal. If we look at recent income trends, you'll see almost no growth, indeed none at all, between 1974 and 2010. 35, 36 years, no growth in real median income at the bottom. On the other hand, at the top, between 1974 and 2010, a very significant growth of $56,000. If you look at percent change in real median income between 2007, when the recession began, and 2010, everyone suffered, even the top 25%. But again, the poorer you were, the more you suffered. So this is what we saw. When we did give tax cuts, they overwhelmingly went to the rich. $44,000 for them, less than $100 for people in the bottom quintile. And then if you look, and I think we'll hear more from Joe, what we have seen in growth, where we've had growth, it's almost all gone to profits, with very little going to wages and benefits. So we've not only seen growing inequality, but we've seen a shift from growth in wages and benefits to simply a growth in profits. The other thing I want to close on is income mobility. This wouldn't be so bad if, in fact, people had a chance to move up. There's always going to be a bottom quintile. There'll always be a top quintile. Is there much movement between it? And here in the United States, there's almost none. If you started in the lowest quintile, you ended up there in more than half the cases. Only less than 5% who start in the bottom quintile in America end up in the top fifth. It's not like other countries. Other countries, there's a much greater amount of income mobility. If you start at the bottom, you have a greater opportunity. We're supposedly the opportunity society. It doesn't work out that way. Finally, let me close by suggesting, why have we had such inequality? Years ago, I wrote a Murder on the Inequality Express. For those who remember Agatha Christie, you'll know where that comes from. They all did it. Technology is one suspect. Another is deindustrialization. Another is deregulation. Another is declining unionization. Still another is the downsizing of major companies. The winner-take-all labor markets where a few people get all the benefits. Free trade rather than fair trade. Capital mobility, leaving the country. Immigration. Trade deficits. All of those things combine to create the problems we have, and we have to work on all of them. So that is where we are as a beginning, and I think our next speaker is Joe McLaughlin.
Another Dukakis undergraduate. Am I on?
Okay. Ready to go?
Anyway, Joe also was an undergraduate student of mine. That was quite a long time ago. He's now a senior associate in a very, very fine center. I guess I better turn it on. Hello? Yeah. Sorry. Is that a senior moment or what, maybe? Joe was an undergraduate of mine several years ago and is now a senior research associate at the Center for Labor Market Studies here at Northeastern, which is one of the finest in the country, led by a wonderful guy named Andy Sum, for whom Joe has worked for many years. They do terrific studies and analyses, which you read about all the time, and particularly on the kinds of issues that Barry just described. So, Joe, take it away.
Thank you, Governor Dukakis. Am I on? Okay. I wasn't a student that long ago, I like to think. But I came here today to really discuss the research that the Center for Labor Market Studies and I have done over the past few years, tracking the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, and then most of my time will be spent on the so-called economic recovery from that recession. Just to start in, we call this recession the Great Recession because it was long, it was 18 months, it was longer than any other recession post-World War II history, and also because of our real output declines, our employment declines, and our rise in the unemployment rate matched or surpassed those of any other previous recession. So by any measure, it was a very severe recession, hence why we call it a Great Recession. Now, we lost, over the course of this recession, we lost over 8 million jobs. We measure that from the fourth quarter of 2007 through the second quarter of 2009, and then we followed through the second quarter of 2010, which was the trough. We went from 138 million jobs in the U.S. to 130 million, over 8 million. Now today, third quarter 2011, we're only back to slightly over 131 million. We're still down 6.5 million jobs. We've only gained back about 1 million in the recovery. So by any measure, this has been a jobless recovery. Now, part of the reason why this recession has been so severe, as I mentioned, is our output declines. This is a chart showing the trends in real GDP from fourth quarter 2007 through the most current quarter available, which is the third quarter of 2011. I mean, you notice that our nation's output, which our real GDP is our gross domestic product, it's a measure of the final value final market value of all our goods and services. And we fell from 13.3 trillion to 12.6 trillion. There's a decline of about 5%. It's very severe. And that led to all the reductions in our employment. Our corporations and firms cut jobs way faster than most other countries. But now you'll see that from second quarter 2009, on my chart, we had a fairly good growth, 6% growth through third quarter 2011 in our output. So we've gained back, and now we're back to where we were in 2007. By any measure, not a good performance, because we're only back to where we were 4 years ago. We're well below our potential, but we did grow. So the question is, who gained from this growth over the past 2 years? And how do we achieve it? Now, I just showed you that we didn't gain employment back. So there's two other primary ways to raise our output, is to either work our existing workers more hours, which we did slightly during the recovery, or to get more out of each worker. And that's our labor productivity measure. And this is an index of real output per hour of work. How much do we get from each hour of our labor? And you'll notice that from the second quarter of 2009, when the recovery began, through 2011 third quarter, our productivity increased. Workers produced more. That's how we grew. From the fourth quarter of 2008 through today, we're up about 8% on labor productivity. Now, the way capitalism is supposed to work is that when our workers produce more, you can have two things happen. One, they're paid more, right? We pay them more. And the other thing is that productivity could also be returned to us in form of lower prices. The third thing is it could go to corporate profits, which I'll show you is overwhelmingly did over the past couple of years. But this is a chart just showing real weekly earnings of our full-time wage and salary workers. You'll notice that they actually grew a little bit during the course of a recession from 2007 to 2009 as a result of a lot of the lower wage workers being pushed out of the labor market. But since that 2009 second quarter, when we're at $781, we've fallen now through third quarter 2011 to $758. So even though we've become more productive, we're not seeing it in our real wages. So where does it all go? Now, for those of you that have studied economics, you know there's three ways to measure our gross domestic product. One is the income approach. This table is basically the income approach to that measure. If you look at the second column from the left, our national income. It grew from $12.3 trillion to almost $13 trillion from the beginning of the recovery in second quarter 2009 through to third quarter 2011. So our national income rose by $700 billion. But we know that not more people were working. And if you look at total employee compensation, we're only up half a percent, 0.5%, $42 billion. So where did all the money go? Well, it largely went to corporate profits, the second column from the right. Corporate profits rose $592 billion over this time period, or 46%. That $592 billion over $699 billion in national income is 85%. 85% of all national income in this recovery has gone to corporate profits. By far the most lopsided in any time in our history, post-World War II history. In fact, it's never been over 50. The closest it's been is 47% in the 2001 recession. Generally, it's under 30. So this, by far, is a very unique economic recovery, which explains a lot what we're seeing happening in our cities across the country. Now, just two final points. Is every night when you go home on the news, you didn't hear what I told you today. You hear Dow Jones went up 8 points. S&P 500 went up 10 points. And then every couple months you might hear corporate earnings are way up, and that's why stock prices are up. Those are the three bar charts here. Since a recovery, you see the Dow, and this is only through second quarter 2011. So stock markets changed a little bit, but basically they're all up 45 to 50%. The stock market and corporate profits. Here's my proposal: is to put these other indexes on our nightly news. Payroll employment, 0. Mean weekly wages of workers, 0.1. Mean hourly earnings of our production workers or manufacturing workers that led a lot of that recovery back, negative. Okay? If you invest in our workers, you got 0. If you invest in Wall Street, you got 45%. Now, last thing, as Barry mentioned, over this time period, this has been a longer trend than just the Great Recession. This broken link between productivity and workers has been over a longer period of time. But particularly this decade has been weak for the middle class. So what I just wanted to show you, since a lot of the developments today came out of the Occupy movement, is what's happened to the real earnings of Wall Street workers versus all workers. At the top, you see U.S. The average worker increased their annual earnings over the decade by $1,700, about $170 a year. How did Wall Street do? Well, if you worked in investment banking on Manhattan, you grew your earnings over the decade by $44,000. Why is that important? That's about the average annual compensation of an employee in the U.S., $44,000. So your salary increase matched what the average worker got for their entire year. Securities and brokerage is up even higher. On the bottom in Massachusetts, you see over the decade, the average private sector worker in Massachusetts only got $55 more over the decade. If you worked in investment banking here in Massachusetts, but a Wall Street job, you were up $67,000, $68,000, more than the average worker. So when people ask, why are people occupying Wall Street? You could ask, why not occupy Wall Street?
Did we train him well? What do you think? Tom Shapiro is and has been at Brandeis for many years. Primary interest is racial inequality and public policy, and he'll talk to us about those subjects this morning. Tom, welcome to Northeastern.
Thank you very much. It's a welcome back. I taught here for 25 years and have been on the stage many times before. Good morning, everybody. I hope this will not be death by data, but I do think it's important to do some visualization on some of the trends that we're looking at. I promise I'm not going to sing and I'm not going to rap, but I am going to start with a famous Italian financier and navigator who reminds us that I think we know what we're talking about. I think we experience it in our everyday lives and we see it around us. We don't need a lot of theory at this point, if you will, about inequality, but we do need to understand what the patterns look like. And we do need to understand a bit about why this has come about. So I promise not to sing, but our anthem, if you will, and the anthem of the Occupy movement comes from the Night Watchman. And it comes from the saying that history is not made by kings, history is not made by popes, history is not made by 9 men in robes, history is not made by billionaires, history is not made by CIA dope runners. No, history is made by the people. So what I need to focus on here is the role that policy has implications for wealth inequality in the United States. And I want us to look at a number of different pieces of data visualization. I want to start a little bit with the narrative first. And I know you're going to be hearing a lot about this as we go along. And what we're talking about is the total, utter coincidence between 1929 and today. 2 different points in time that we just picked at random, as some people would have us believe. Top income tax bracket. The numbers itself are not important. Just look at the way the graph goes. Has nothing to do with inequality today. The estate tax bracket has nothing to do with inequality today, especially wealth inequality. Top corporate tax rate has nothing to do with inequality today, or wealth inequality. And just quickly to put all those 3 together, you see where those charts are all going in the exact same direction. The result? Massive wealth inequality, toxic wealth inequality, where today the top 1% garners like 43% of total financial wealth. And by total financial wealth, what we mean is the total resources that a family or an individual has at their disposal, not just their income, their stocks, their bonds. The largest part of the average American family's wealth portfolio is their home equity, the value that their homes have increased over time, and the institutional processes that the foreclosure movement, that real estate markets, and that racial and ethnic color coding of home equity plays in that process. And if you add the top 1% and the top next 4%, you see that over 70% of the financial wealth in American society is held by a very slim minority. How did that come about? It comes about not out of natural causes, but I've been wanting to try and make the policy case for us this morning. The ways in which policy has created the levels of inequality that we live with today. And to the extent to which that is accurate, policy will also be a tool that allows us to play the remaking of a much more just and equitable society down the road. One way that policy plays a very significant role here is to look at what I call the wealth budget of the United States government. That is, the family and individual wealth-building provisions built into our tax expenditures. That's never on the daily news. In fact, the expression tax expenditures I should probably roll, because it's not something that we have a lot of expertise or understand very well. But it's essentially those taxes that we don't have to pay because we do things that policy is rewarding us for. Annually, that wealth-building budget through tax expenditures is about $400 billion a year. That's not a one-off. That's every single year repeated. It might be one thing if that $400 billion were distributed somewhat equitably for wealth-building activities for American families, but that's far from the case, as the slide before you shows. Of that $400 billion, approximately 45% of that goes to the top 1%. That's how wealth inequality is created through policy.
And Tom, a tax expenditure, just for the sake of the audience.
The main tax expenditure that we're talking about here, the largest one, is essentially the amount you can take off your taxes for paying interest on your home mortgage. All right. Now, that sounds like it benefits everybody. A case perhaps could be made for that, but when one looks at who makes those filings and the McMansions that exist, the top 1% and top 5% are garnering the lion's share of that particular tax expenditure. The second largest one are the taxes that we don't pay for putting money aside for retirement, pensions, etc.
So these are basically tax deductions given to people.
These are, we might call it tax deductions, but it literally is a government subsidy for wealth creation. All right? And I think we need to think about it in that way. If I can use the expression, the bottom 60% of the population receives about 4% of those benefits. This area, changing that pie chart, becomes, I think, a necessity when we're talking about reversing the direction of inequality in American society. During the Great Recession, a lot of wealth has been lost, not just by those at the bottom who had little to start with, but essentially by almost every group except the top 1% or so. Between 2005 and 2009, the Pew Research Center recently gave us this brilliant study that told us among the white community, about 16% of all of their wealth was lost. But look what happens in the Hispanic community and the African American community. It's almost unbelievable to think that about 2/3 of the wealth of the average Hispanic family in the United States was lost, and 55% among the African American community. So in addition to there being a top-bottom, very important conversation about wealth inequality, there also is a very important piece of that that has to do with the racial and ethnic wealth gap in the United States. And I wanted to end with one or two quick slides on that. The racial wealth gap from data that I and my institute have ran very recently, the racial wealth gap in the United States, that is measuring the typical wealth of the typical African American family, median to median, and comparing that to the median wealth of average white families, that gap was $20,000 in 1984. Over the next 23 years, following the same set of families as they march through American institutions and the levels of persistent discrimination and different opportunities to create, accumulate, and grow their financial wealth, that racial wealth gap grows to $95,000. And for those of us that might suspect on the Murder on the Orient Express that that has to do with, it might be the case that they're much more high-earning whites than high-earning African Americans, please take a look at this chart. What we see on this chart, the blue line on the top, the line where we would like everybody in American society to be, is the growth of family wealth between 1984 and 2007. A very healthy, steep curve that raises the ceiling. The red line is high-earning African American families in 1984 that almost had the same level of earnings as high earnings of whites in 1984, but look what happens to their wealth over the next 23 years. It actually declines. So there's something going on that has to do with race and institutional dynamics in American society that tells us a lot about not only wealth inequality, but the racial wealth gap. And finally, I promised I wouldn't rap, but one of the great social scientists in American society reminds us about the moment that we're in. The song is about a very different context. But look, if you only had one shot or one opportunity to seize everything you ever wanted in one moment, would you capture it? Or would you just let it slip? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. Liz Cohen is the chairman of the history department at Harvard, and she thinks, like a lot of us, that we can learn a lot from history. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you, these have been very stunning and depressing data, and I'm going to give you a little interlude of an alternative that may be a little bit more uplifting. Thousands of Americans are losing their homes to foreclosures, their jobs to employer cutbacks, their self-confidence and their confidence in America to economic hardship. For many, time unemployed is stretching frighteningly from months to years. The Democratic president, elected on eloquent promises to stem the worsening depression, seems to be foundering in the face of a cataclysm that eludes his best efforts to tame it. The nation seems more and more divided between the haves and the have-nots. Meanwhile, rumblings are growing ever louder of a more radical popular mobilization for action, while defenders of the status quo respond with charges of class warfare. Is this Barack Obama's America of 2011? No, it's Franklin Roosevelt's America of 1935. As an historian, I'd be the last to suggest that we've been here before and that there's any truth to the platitude that history repeats itself. What I will say, however, is that an historical perspective can offer insights into the present that may escape the close-up lens that we inevitably look through today. Many of us assembled here view the current recession as only the visible tip of a much deeper economic crisis, and we seek to reclaim our economy and our democracy. As we do so, there are lessons we can learn from 75 years ago, when, for the first time in U.S. history, a viable industrial unionism somehow arose out of the ashes of catastrophic depression. That industrial unionism, made possible by Congress's passage of the National Labor Relations Act, popularly known as the Wagner Act, but secured, and this is key, by fierce organizing by the CIO and by many, many rank-and-file activists at the grassroots, launched a whole new era of collective bargaining for wages, hours, and workplace governance. And I would go so far as to argue that the widespread prosperity of the post-World War II era, which we have seen evidence of, from the 1950s into the mid-1970s, can be directly attributed to that victory, even with the constraints on unionization that were later imposed by the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Job security, decent wages, and flourishing, stable manufacturing and service sectors made possible an America of responsible mass home ownership, mass consumption, high rates of high school graduation and college attendance, and more. So what can we learn from the popular mobilization of the 1930s that might help us today? I'd like to focus on three critical issues. First, build coalitions and what I call a culture of unity. Second, don't forget electoral politics. Third, argue for what I call a moral capitalism. First, coalition building. In the early exciting years of union organizing in Detroit, Flint, Chicago, Akron, Pittsburgh, and many other industrial cities, succeeding meant crossing the ethnic and racial boundaries that long had kept first and second generation immigrant workers divided and unions at bay. In a move that was brazen at the time, the CIO made deliberate, extensive efforts to create solidarity across borders that long had divided workers to the benefit of employers, most recently and notably in the failures of the 1919 era of organizing after World War I. In the drives of the 1930s, unions worked hard to reach out to ordinary working people in their own languages, in their dispersed, ethnically defined neighborhoods, and in their respective churches and community associations. George Patterson, a Scottish immigrant steelworker in Chicago, who signed on to the organizing effort soon after the CIO came to town, recalled the concrete way that he experienced this new coalition through his stomach, and I quote him, "I, who had been confined to the four walls of a steel mill, now found out about Hungarian goulash, minestrone soup, lox and blintzes of cream cheese, corned beef on hard rolls or rye bread, gefilte fish, and other exotic dishes," end quote. Most controversial of all at this time was the CIO's recognition that in contrast to almost all prior organizing efforts, when African Americans had been scorned by their white coworkers and utilized by employers as strikebreakers, black and white workers would need to ally. In 1936, remember, this was not an easy message to give or to receive. But in time, most everyone came to realize that it was the only way to win. Accordingly, union locals embraced what we might call a culture of unity, using the radio, recreational and social programs, women's auxiliaries, and the like, to create a new kind of space in American society explicitly committed to fostering ethnic and racial unity for the collective benefit of all. In today's world, the ethnic barriers of the 1930s no longer pose the problem, but divisions of race, immigrants versus citizens, generations, gender and sexuality, and many more still keep dissatisfied Americans more apart than united. George Patterson, our friend in Chicago, points us to a second lesson of the New Deal era of use today. Patterson soon learned the importance of asserting himself and rallying others as a Democratic Party member and voter, enthusiastically supporting Roosevelt's National Democratic Party. George had become a citizen of the United States during the 1920s, but he had not found national politics very relevant to his life in Chicago. Quote, "I had cast maybe one ballot in a national election before the 1930s," he later recalled. But now, in the midst of the catastrophic Great Depression, George and many other working-class Americans of different nationalities and races saw the National Democratic Party's New Deal and Roosevelt quite personally as their savior. And this is an Italian restaurant where you see FDR in the prized place above the bar. By 1936, they were voting in record numbers and voting Democratic. Most remarkably, African Americans, who long had been loyal to the party of Lincoln when they were able to vote, which was in itself an incentive for moving north for industrial jobs and to industrial cities, now shifted noticeably to the Democratic column. Although in time, divisions grew within the CIO over how closely to align with the Democratic Party, unions never forgot how important was their power at the polls. When Roosevelt racked up almost 61% of the popular vote and more than 98% of the electoral vote in 1936, and won again with a comfortable margin in 1940 in a controversial race for an unprecedented third term, deep support from working-class Americans undeniably helped carry the day. That debt, moreover, carried with it the obligation to deliver on labor and social legislation, minimum wages and maximum hours, Social Security, unemployment benefits, and the like, and gave Roosevelt the confidence in 1936 to boldly declare war on those he labeled economic royalists, as despotic in their own way as the British enemy of 1776. With the arrival of the Great Depression, FDR proclaimed in his acceptance speech of his renomination in Philadelphia at the Democratic Convention in 1936, and I quote him, and this is pretty powerful rhetoric, "The political equality we once had won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group had concentrated into their own hands an almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. Our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power," Roosevelt concluded. And he went on, "It is not alone a war against want and destitution and economic demoralization. It is more than that. It is a war for the survival of democracy," end quote. Today, it's not clear what organizations and institutions and organizing strategies can do the work of galvanizing voters that unions once did. Even as unions are benefiting from rising discontent, the nature of our current economy and the decline of union membership limit their electoral effectiveness. But then we must identify other vehicles for making electoral politics work for all Americans. We have little choice in a representative democracy. Finally, I want to talk about the ideology that many working Americans held and that organizers who articulated their demands expressed. That is an ideology that I have labeled moral capitalism. There is no denying that the Communist Party was active and effective in the 1930s in ways that it had not been since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. What had been a small coterie of sympathetic leftists in the teens and the 1920s did become a larger community of party members in the 1930s. But the average American worker facing the devastating impact of the Great Depression never joined the Communist Party, nor felt attracted to the party's socialist message. Instead, I would argue, ordinary rank-and-file Americans were animated and politicized around a call for a more moral capitalism. They wanted to earn a good living, to own a home, to be able to retire in old age, to leave something to their children. Revolutionaries they were not, but the conscience of capitalism they aimed to become, challenging their bosses to live up to the oft-touted benefits for all of American-style capitalism. The presence of a communist Soviet Union in the 1930s may have helped workers place themselves ideologically and morally in between austere socialism on the one hand and indulgent capitalism on the other. But we still might take a lesson from our New Deal teachers and push today's compelling rhetoric of the 1 versus 99% a step further to argue that the 1% have not only been greedy, but they have irresponsibly endangered the viability of American capitalism for all Americans. They should be portrayed as the enemy of the people and the American way.
We've got a little time. We've caught up a bit, but not entirely. We've got a little time, maybe 5 minutes for a question or two or three, but make them brief and keep your speeches to a minimum.
We have mics, John?
Where are the hand mics? Hold on. Hand mics, hand mics. Got them? We have a question right down here.
Where's the hand?
Right here, right here. So right there. Thanks. That was great.
I actually have to.
I think you're on. Yes?
She has to hold it.
You got it. You
I
got it.
have to hold it.
I'll hold it.
Okay.
I'll give it back.
Okay.
I wanted to ask Professor Cohen to talk about some of the influences of technology and globalization on the vision for how we affect change in a similar way that was affected back in the 1930s. Because my feeling is that things have changed, and it's not so easy anymore.
Oh, that's a very big question. A good question for us all probably to think about. But there's technological change has taken place forever in a certain way, and certainly the 19th century was a time of tremendous technological change and industrial revolution, and employers had implemented lots of labor saving in the 1920s and actually took full advantage of the Depression to mechanize and get rid of jobs even more in the 1930s. So there was a lot of that. So I'm not sure that we can say that technology alone, the sort of speed at which it's sort of taken off, would make this kind of organizing that happened in the 1930s impossible today. This is not my area of expertise, and I would be interested in what other people say. But I think that many of the other lessons here about finding common ground are probably the most compelling. And I've been thinking a little bit about why the healthcare issue didn't do it. Because you would have thought, with the kind of numbers you gave us, that healthcare, the crisis of health insurance would have actually provided some of that kind of common ground shared issue. And I think what we saw were Americans still dividing between those who had that health insurance and those who hadn't. I'm wondering if another issue might be more compelling, and that is retirement. I mean, even Americans who live, who are doing fairly well, according to our data, you people probably know better than I, are not saving money. It's true that, the tax deduction of the 401ks and so forth does cushion a certain percentage of Americans. But I think a lot of the baby boomers are going to be in big trouble, in another 10 years. So I'm just wondering if we might be looking for issues that can cut across some of these barriers and create some of that common ground.
You could argue that the technology has helped the Occupy movement. I mean, I assume you guys are using the internet, right? And all kinds of other stuff that I don't even understand. So in some ways, it's an organizing tool. And any of us in politics know how important the internet has become as an organizing tool and a fundraising tool to raise money from a very broad base of relatively moderate contributors. I mean, Obama had 4 million contributors. It raised $750 million in 2008. That was unprecedented, and it had everything to do with the internet as a fundraising tool. But I would argue, and I know you guys are making the speeches, I'm not, but I think the way the Democrats framed the health care issue was just wrong, and I'm the last guy in the world to advise the president how to communicate, I mean, given my track record nationally. But this should have been all about working people, in my judgment. Instead, it was about insurance reform, pre-existing conditions, all this kind of stuff, which a lot of people really, whether or not your kid could stay on your policy until he or she was 26. All of that's interesting. But the fundamental fact of the matter is the uninsured in this country are overwhelmingly working and members of working families. And I don't think the Democrats said that at all. So people don't understand it. And there isn't that sense of solidarity that comes from recognizing that most of us are in that boat. One more. Yeah.
I was just curious. Thanks for the historical lesson on the Great Depression. I think that was great. The role when Mike Dukakis mentioned Ohio, I thought he was going to talk about the fight around collective bargaining and the incredible victory that took place last week in Ohio, which is a combination both of union mobilization and electoral power. And I just curious, the whole attack on public sector, the attack on government functions, and the revitalization of labor, both public and private, in terms of community good. How does that culture contribute to another vision?
The point I was trying to make was that that was the good news in Ohio, but the bad news was that the very same people who went out and supported unions voted against the so-called individual mandate, which of course we have folks all over the place, right? We have individual mandates for Social Security, Medicare, auto insurance, I mean, you name it. There's nothing unusual about this, and yet here was an industrial state, working class folks voting against this kind of thing. That's a failure on our part, it seems to me. Anyway, what do you think, Barry?
Let me just say one quick thing. We have to move on to our next panel. But I agree with you. The victory in Ohio, and indeed the victory in Mississippi over the whole question of women's rights, were tremendous victories, and gives me great hope that the movement that we've begun seeing when the first demonstrations in Madison, Wisconsin, following their governor's attack on workers, right through what we saw in Tuesday's elections, makes me believe that what we're doing here in the teach-in movement, which we hope moves from here to one campus to another, Occupy from one city to the next, that we're starting to galvanize the kinds of folks and bringing them together around a coherent message that will resonate in November 2012. That's what I hope will happen, and we've seen kind of the first signs of hope. We saw the Arab Spring, and now we're seeing America's autumn moving forward into next spring. Thank you very much.
Round of applause for this terrific panel. Thank you. Great. Now, I'm going to get off the stage for a while and introduce our next moderator, another one of those terrific young people who came to work for me when I was elected to the governorship in '82, was my deputy general counsel, chairman of the parole board, and went on to all kinds of things. Now vice president here at Northeastern, Bob Gittens. Bob, where are you?